Hi, good afternoon, folks. My name is Larry Ossei-Mensah. I'm here and I have the honor to be in conversation with Amber Robles-Gordon, who I have been collaborating with on the solo exhibition Successions Traversing US Colonialism, which will open at American University's Museums Gallery August 28th to December 10th, I believe.
Oh,
So basically fall of this year. We've been we've been working on this show for many moons,
many
and
moons.
I'm really excited for it to finally come to fruition and be able to share this with audiences in the DC metro area. And so, welcome, Amber. How you feeling?
I'm pretty good. How about you?
I'm good. I'm good. We see you're at the gallery.
I
In
am.
in the midst of installs, so folks are getting a little bit of a behind the scenes look. By the time they see this, the show will be up. But I think it was important that people were able to hear you speak about the show and the work while you're in the gallery. Um, and so, Successions as an exhibition really is a conceptual juxtaposition that's celebrating abstraction as an art form, but it's also leveraging and interrogating these past histories, particularly with regard to territories and districts that are part of, I guess, the United States, in quotes, specifically looking at Puerto Rico, where you were born,
Mm-hmm.
but also looking at DC, where you've lived almost 2 decades, if I'm correct,
Mm-hmm.
and other territories like Guam, USVI, which you also have a personal relationship with,
American Samoa.
and really try America, Samoa, North Marina Islands.
Mhm.
There's so many territories that I don't think we all are aware that the U.S. actually controls. And so I think that's thing to kind of have this conversation in the District of Columbia, because I think people don't realize that it's also kind of a territory as well. It's not necessarily a state.
It's absolutely
And
not a
so
state.
bringing those conversations to the fore, those policies that have been put in place that have been suppressive and oppressive to a lot of communities, whether it's in the Pacific Islands or in the Caribbean. So, excited to talk about the work and the show, but I guess if maybe to give some context, if you want to just give a bit more background about who you are, um, your practice, and how did this show kind of come to fruition, the ideas around the show.
Absolutely. So yes, my name is Amber Robles-Gordon. I still stick to the, I guess, moniker or title, a mixed media artist. I am definitely a painter in the sense where I use objects to paint. And the objects that I choose really depend on what I'm trying to convey. Um, I have been practicing for, wow, like you said, graduating in 2011 from Howard, but I've known I wanted to be an artist since I was really early in my life, so around 8 or so. A good portion of my life has been focused on public artwork and sculpture, but I just love creating. That literally brings me joy. Um, that and materiality. It's what I do, what I find to be like reciprocal. It gives me energy as I create and transform things. It brings energy. There's an exchange that happens, and I'm so grateful for it that it still happens. You know, um,
And so, what was it about Successions, this particular exhibition? Because there's two bodies of work. If you can
absolutely.
talk a little bit about both series, um, why did you make these works? Why now? What was it that you wanted or want the viewers to kind of understand and question and think about when they do come see the exhibition?
So I came to this kind of journey through the series now called Place of Breath and Birth. And what that meant for me was that because I was born in Puerto Rico, but I was raised in the States, meaning the mainland United States, I hadn't had an experience of actually meeting some of the family that I had in Puerto Rico or experiencing Puerto Rico. I have been back and forth to St. Thomas and some of the other islands where I also have family, but never PR, my birthplace. So I knew by a certain age that I needed to make that happen. I needed to go back and have some type of cultural, spiritual interaction with where I was born. So it started as that. But through the process, there was also what happened in relationship to Mother Nature, basically. The hurricanes, the earthquakes that happened starting in 2017, I believe, Irma and I think it was Maria. And some of the things that I was seeing during that disaster, really two disasters, one after the other, in relationship to how the U.S. was relating to Puerto Ricans and U.S. Islanders, was very disturbing and was heartbreaking. So that also triggered. Then later on, when I made the leap and said, hey, I'm going to I'm doing this self-appointed residency and working with the Sagrada de Corazon, Sacred Heart University, to do their artist in residence program there. So that's what initiated, it was a personal journey, but then also it became, I don't even know how to describe it. It just became like a community, but also something that I felt I had to represent in some way, because it highlighted my experience there in PR, and then realizing that I've lived in this region called the District of Columbia, which is not a state. But some of the controversy and some of the tit for tat that happens around not giving people, allowing them the benefits,
The right to have agency.
yes,
Because they
yes,
can
and then
only, there's a committee, I forget I don't recall the name of the committee that was put in place during the debt crisis. They
the one in PR,
can't
yes.
necessarily, so they can't vote for president, if I'm correct.
Oh no, they cannot,
And
especially not on the
so,
island.
yeah. And the thing is, so they're part of the United States, technically. You're using Puerto Rico as an example, but do not get the full benefits to govern themselves, only to a
Exactly.
degree.
And
So,
unfortunately, that scenario it's kind of duplicated in all of the territories or commonwealths. It's a version of that for each one, technically, except for what is it? It might be America, Northern Mariana Islands. That is not. They are not U.S. citizens. They're U.S. citizens, but they have to go through a process to then. It's ridiculous. It's really sad and
yeah.
ridiculous. And
And
what
I
I
think,
began to
and I think
notice
we
is
don't
that,
think about, no, go ahead. Go
so
ahead.
what I began to notice is that when you think about some of these territories in this Commonwealth, these are all people that are considered what I consider of color. They are non-European, non-white people. And then when you start to research some of the history around how these some of the islands were annexed and or they were kind of acquired during at the end of a war, of a battle. And then you slowly see the conversations that the United States has publicly had about why these particular places cannot have sovereignty. They cannot be on their own. They cannot be granted the rights that other states within the U.S. have. And some of that, I I personally believe is because of race or your skin color, language, and flat out, meaning if you give them the right to vote for presidency and for to have greater influence on our political system, the system would change.
Mhm.
And they don't know what to do with that.
Mhm.
And they've been fighting that for so long. And what is amazing to me is that reflects. If you look, you can just open up your a news app. You can open up Instagram. You can open up Facebook, and you see iterations of this conversation happening, of people of color saying, you know what, this isn't okay. Um, so
So, what? So you've mentioned the constellation of concerns, but what was some of the core questions that you were interested in investigating through the works in the show?
I think one of the biggest things was environmental racism. You know,
Okay.
I absolutely, because I have a grandmother and many other relatives that live in St. Thomas. So I remember like when you engage in when my conversation with my grandmother, one of the things she'll reference is Hugo, which is Hurricane Hugo. And I don't remember, I
Mm-hmm.
think it was in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened is that it was a huge hurricane and it affected the islands for years to come. So there was always a reference point of saying, oh, my life was going this way until Hugo happened. And I say that because that happens tremendously on the islands because
Mm-hmm.
of where they are, because they're surrounded by water. If it's not a hurricane, it's an earthquake, or it's what is that, a something, cyclone? Anyway, it's a earthquake uh, that is the equivalent of, but with water, mainly water.
Which is an essential theme aesthetically in a lot of the works,
Yes,
particularly
absolutely,
like the work behind you.
absolutely. Um, so, and one of the ways I depict that throughout the work is I use like I think it's like the Doppler system. So if you look up
Mm-hmm.
a like how was Hurricane Irma or Maria
Mm-hmm.
depicted, you'll see iterations of the Doppler system, and it will show you how the hurricane kind of moved on or progressed. And what it does is it shows you in the heat of it, it'll show you the red, then it'll show
Mm.
you the how it like a gradation to some a color gradation, and it zooms out. So
Mm.
I elaborated on that, one because I just love color, but and two because of aesthetics. But the main reason I'm drawn to that was because it talks about the pressure points and it shows how much weather impacts these
Mm.
islands.
Nature. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And so some of it is something, you know, that they may not be specifically able to control, because a lot of it has to do with global warming, period. And that's something
Mm-hmm.
that just one island can't control. It has to be a serious amount of change in our world, the way we treat and handle our world, and our products that we waste, and how we
Mm-hmm.
repurpose them. But also what happens is that because they're under US rule, it's also about how are monies allocated, time, money, energy allocated once these things have happened, and or preventive measures to prevent
Mm-hmm.
some of the things in relationship to how they impact the society on the islands. So
Mm-hmm.
that was really important to me. That was one of the main things. Then I will say the other thing, and the thing that kind of really moved the series along, was deciding that only focusing on the political aspects of the islands wasn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
Once, and I think some of that is also just because I love sculpture, I love installations, but I was looking at the work, especially the first two. I don't know if you remember me having this conversation with you, and I was like, I can't keep the works one sided, because
Mm-hmm.
to me it would
Yeah.
only represent one one sliver of the conversation and how we reflect on on a people, you know, nations, and culture and spirituality. And that's what made me say, hey, Larry and Jack, I need to make these double-sided. It's going to take a little longer, but I need to make them double-sided. And so I think that was a really big departure for the works in general. I needed to make them whole. And
And
so
then so this double sided that you referred to is the spiritual side.
the spiritual and
You
cultural,
know, the
yeah,
indigenous, you know, I think traditional practices.
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Um, well, what I did was, at first I was diving into actual, you know, symbology and or very specific references, and then I decided that I didn't want to do that. I wanted to keep it universal. And I'm drawn to things like sacred geometry and geometric forms. So I decided to keep it to a level of which everyone could relate. And I literally, you know, one of the books that I was reading throughout this was of Water and Spirits by Sommet. I can't remember his first name, but and I just focused on where the materials and where the energy took me through each works. And I literally just had to trust that whatever it is guiding me, you know, and makes me find the love and the energy and I think the courage to do some of the works that I do, was going to make sure that I represented as best as I could each entity, each group, um, with dignity, you know, and
Mhm.
with grace, and as best as I could. I don't know if that's a full answer, but that's the answer that I
Yeah,
got.
no, I mean, and then I think the other thing that I believe was an integral variable in just making the work was that, you know, some of this work was made on the ground while you were doing research, but then also you were in San Juan, you know, kind of peak time during COVID.
Yeah,
How
absolutely.
did, you know, being on the ground, I think, shift how you thought about um, engaging with, you know, your history, um, your personal history, these communities, um, trying to tell the stories of these communities that, you
Yeah.
know, once the news cameras leave, they still kind of have to deal with the ripple effects of two
Yes.
hurricanes, COVID, lack
Yes.
of resources,
Yes. And the
etc.
earthquakes and then on
Yeah.
top of that, and in the middle of a global pandemic, you know, and I was really glad when I read your statement that you brought that to, you highlighted that in the statement that, you know, some of these issues, of course, have been brought up before, but they're unfortunately what happens is that news continues to happen and then they're taken down, and they're taken on to a different level of like exposure.
Hmm.
Um, one of the things that had happened while we were there was not having access to resources, like
Mm.
or finding out, because I knew I was going to be doing collaging, and I thought that I was going to be doing more collaging, not just with Place of Breath and Birth. I thought that the quilts would be collaged a little bit more, but I didn't realize that magazines were not readily available in PR. And this was right before the pandemic hit. And so I was like, crap, because literally for some of my works, I can just go get and I choose some of the fatter, meatier magazines that have editorial things because the color, the range of colors, and or objects and or, I don't know how else to explain that, but they're,
And can you, sorry to cut you off, can you also just use this also as an opportunity to talk a little bit about process as well?
sure.
You know, just as it, because since you're talking about it, we might as well go a little deeper if we can.
Okay. Um, so things like Vogue or Elle or which I will say is a philosophical, you know, pet peeve of mine because there's no equivalent black or magazine of color to those as of yet that I've seen. But anyway, but they weren't available on the island, or at least where I was. And we searched a good portion of the place. So what happened was we eventually had to go through some of the older bookstores. And we found one that had just boxes and boxes and boxes of those magazines or architectural magazines. Those are really good as well. And then after that, what hit was, the pandemic, the shutdown. And so things like art supplies we couldn't get. And at that point, they also weren't doing shipping, and or it was extremely expensive to ship. So you really had to, to make big decisions about supplies. And so I'm gonna finish talking about like when we transitioned. So there was one point where Rafael and I had to make a decision about whether to stay in PR or to go, and that was when the governor of PR was making the decisions regarding closing the airports. And I'm pretty sure that was March of 2020. And that was going to be a really hard thing for me because I had things that I needed to, commitments that I needed to go back and forth and be able to get to the States, to DC. So that's when we left, when we had to leave. And so now we've been in DC since. So process. I think for A Place of Breath and Birth, one of the things that really moved the works and the narrative in those works was where I was staying, where we lived while we were there. And we chose a place that was like
which part of town were you?
Puerto Nuevo. And it was almost like it was on the third level of the building. And you could literally see out. Wow. We measured it one day. I can't remember how long it was, but you could see, I don't know, maybe 5-6 miles each direction, or at least like a good 320, you know? And you can, depending on the time of the day, you could see like the city shift, change, and morph. And that was absolutely, it was beautiful to me, and just kind of put you in a trance, if I can say that. So I tried to relay that in the works, and tried to get them to have this atmospheric effect, but with paper and with mixed media. And that really, really affected my process with the smaller works. Now the larger works are no joke. They are painted. The largest of them are 90 by 104 inches. So we had to do a layer of paint on one
And they're
side.
quilts,
They're
right?
quilts, yes, thank you. They're quilts, and so we had to put them in a border. And then working on the political side, I was really, I decided to deconstruct either the territory or Commonwealth seal or their flag. Um, and for for that body of work, I wanted to stay away from figuration as much as possible. But then it became very clear once we did the spiritual side of USVI, that figuration literally can be broken down into shapes. Because there was a couple moments when I looked away, and then bam, the Moko Jumbi arose from the USVI spiritual side.
What's that?
So the Moko Jumbi is one of the spiritual guides that, oh, forgive me. I want to say I don't think it's Ghana. It's either Ghana or Nigeria, but it's used in Caribbean carnivals. It is the one that's on the stilts, and it's like the life,
Okay.
the energy of the carnivals. And I believe I named it Mokajumbi Walk Tall, Heal Forward, because it's also a healer. Um, so what happened is these forms where I was trying to do my best to stay, geometric. It and actually all of them there is a figure that comes out, and so I just had to be okay with it.
And then you talk about, deconstructing these kind of figurative forms because there are birds, there's fruit.
Mhm.
Um, but we also talk about, abstraction just as an approach. How challenging was it to kind of use this mode of abstraction to tell these stories and to reveal these histories? And one, and then two, how much does being in DC and being part of this lineage of abstraction with artists like Sam Gilliam and Alma Thomas, to name a few who are predecessors, and use their practice to offer us conversations about a variety of different issues.
Sometimes abstraction is. Sometimes I feel like because it's second nature for me, that it's actually hard for me to explain how or even why I do it. One of the ways that I'm able to, I guess, explain it is that I deal with it in layers. Like, for example, in the quilts, there's the layer of the base paint background, and then I build out to the foreground or into the foreground, depending on how you look at it. And so there is, I place all of the quilts inside the inner into a circle, into a number of circles. And that is also, to some extent, it's like ethereal energy, or my interpretation of ethereal energy. But on the spiritual side, on the political side, it's like I said, in relationship to having a conversation about environmental racism, and the effects of Mother Nature, period. Because it to some extent, it is why we exist, but also because we have treated the world poorly. It is giving us a portion of what we have given it. But also I believe in things like casting spells, and whether it be spells or prayers. And so that's the other reason why I use, in case things of concern or things of that I want to speak to, in circles. But then there was a lot of, like, there's the layer of the string, the line, the thin line, the drawn line, the actual pencil line, and then there's the thicker, the oil pastel. There's the oil pastel and oil paint stick line that fills in and builds up the geometric form. And then, depending on the works, I build in with the layer of the color, the painted color, and or painted fabric. So to me, abstraction is about layers,
Hmm.
and layers in relationship to materiality, but then layers in relationship to meaning, context, narrative.
Okay. And then another important theme that you explore, and that's become more prevalent, is this the notion of Afrolatinidad,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, what does that mean to you, and why was it important that that was like imbued in the DNA of the show?
I think it goes back to why I had to do this. I wanted to do this before I was 30, but I couldn't figure that out in that part of my life. Um, but one of the reasons is because I have an Afro-Latinidad mom who still speaks Spanish, and speaks it fluently and yearns to speak it more. And through her work through child welfare advocacy, she wasn't able to keep that part of her culture as readily in her presence as she wanted to. But one of the things that happened is that my trip back to PR, the first trip back to PR, I did that with my mother. And seeing my mother enliven, like literally enliven, as she was able to speak Spanish and go through places in Bayamon where she grew up, and where she could like retell memories about her sister and my grandmother, my aunt and my grandmother. Um, I wanted to be able to have that bond. I'm sure it's not the exact bond, but my own version of that bond to place, to personhood, and to placemaking with the place that I was born. It was very important, and I really believe that that's how this started. Um, so in each work, I tried to focus on, one of the things that was brought to my attention through that experience. Um, and I say, if I could focus on the one, and maybe later on we can impose a picture into this, but this one is about, so during that first 2 week experience, I was at Sagrada de Corazon, and it's one of the, it's a very, I believe, Catholic. Um, they have literally this where you walk into one of the chapels, and it's a beautiful, but it was so pristine. It was so, I don't know how to explain it. And it was almost devoid of color. Um, and it was something that I've felt before in other places. And it's always something that triggers something in me that says, well, how am I reflected here? Am I reflected here? And it's been one of, like, I guess, my authentic questions. Like, if I'm not reflected here, then why? And or is the reflection really the truth? And I think that's one of my internal questions that I've seeked throughout my works, period. And that absolutely is one of the questions that I'm seeking to answer and/or to question or to bring forth in that work.
Mm. And then last question, what do you want viewers who experience your exhibition to walk away with?
You know, one of the things is about going back. If there's something that you want to search, like on a personal level, because you know, I consider myself a grown ass woman, but even as this part in my life, I needed to go back and find and do something to heal my 5-year-old self that told my mother,
Mm.
after being teased for I don't know how long because I was 5, but teased about being Latina, and speaking Spanish in front of a all white, I guess that was preschool,
Mm.
and I needed to go back and heal her. Um, so I would love, on a personal level, I want to encourage people to go back, figure out where that is. Where is that little person that is hurt? And for
Mm.
whatever reason, go find a way to heal him or her. You deserve
Mm.
that.
Mm.
On a external and community and national, international, I want more of us to ask, what are we really being exposed to? What are we really being, the boundaries that we see in our communities, in our resources, and look beyond yourself, look beyond what is being projected to us. Because literally, one of the things that's being projected to us is that United States is this thing, this shape that goes like that. And it is not. It is absolutely not. That is just mainland United States. There is a whole greater aspect, greater United States, which includes the U.S. territories that are not being treated in the same way, respected, treated for years. And why is that? And why do we still allow it? Why is it
Mm.
still? Because silence is killing.
Mm. And your work is speaking very loudly.
Gracias.
And I think with that, I want to thank you for your time, your commitment, your creativity. I know this is going to be one of several public conversations we'll be having around the exhibition. And just to remind folks, Successions, Traversing US Colonialism opens at the Katzen Art Center at American University August 22nd and will be up through the fall. We are excited to welcome you. I know COVID has made things a little bit more tricky, but we're going
Absolutely.
to do our best to create as many opportunities and avenues for you to see the exhibition. So thank you. We appreciate you guys and be well.
And thank you, Larry.
My pleasure.